Hey, something that came across the other day was a question about heart rate variability, what it means, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if it's more of what's coming across my feed and the things that I'm interested in terms of reading about, or I don't know, people just aren't talking about it very much. I definitely agree that using any kind of technology has limitations and drawbacks, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe it's somewhat of a pendulum where it was very, very exciting a few years ago and maybe less. Heart rate variability, and basically, in a more broader sense, I'm going to call compensatory physiology, or these electrical signals that don't necessarily indicate A or B, but give you an idea of how the body is compensating. Huge, tremendous part of what I'm still doing. And for the 10 years that we were able to accomplish some very special things in Canada basketball, including at the European Congress of Sports Science in 2016, had a poster published using some of these compensatory measures in terms of creating the probability of wins and losses in elite level basketball. The data that we used or found probably should not be applicable to other sports or other situations, but the fact is that you can be able to use some of these measures. And of course, for something to even get that far to a poster would probably have to be reproducible. So there was nothing out of our omega wave data that was black boxed. Everything somebody could reach in and then run the numbers themselves. And part of that is understanding heart rate variability and the decisions that we were making when those numbers were tracking in particular directions. So let's talk more heart rate variability and this particular question, because while I just suggest it's a very, very important part of many, not all situations that I work in, it doesn't tell the whole story. And I think where it sits with a lot of the more accessible technologies now, the stuff that's a little bit easier to wrap your head around, is there's a lot of the story and the utility of the number that you call heart rate variability that really has a lot of things to review. So let's try to understand what is that number of heart rate variability. All right, now up behind me you have two beats of the heart. All right, maybe there's an 80s song somewhere in there. Now each of these little peaks here has their own letter. Whether you call it an ECG, or if you're from German descent like me, then you'll call it an EKG. But what we're going to try to zero in on is the R, okay? Because the number that you read on all your favorite little technologies that reads RMSSD is measuring the R to R and using the distance between successive beats to create that number, okay? So we're going to say P, Q, R, S, T, okay? P, Q, R, S, and T, all right? So now the measure that we're most interested in is the time between R and R when we're measuring RMSSD, the root mean square of successive differences, okay? So you're going to take as many heartbeats that you see fit. Most technologies, including EKGs at the medical level, will eliminate artifacts, and that's important to judge when you want to know if your favorite technology is something that's going to be valid, even if they do let you open up their white paper. Now, the equation is whatever, you're measuring the difference, where basically if we see that between a whole bunch of successive beats, this is enough of a difference, your number is very, very high. We think this is good. This is probably good for motor skill acquisition. This is good for consistent, predictable performance. If you find that this distance, it does not have a lot of differences across all of the beats that you're measuring, then you'll have a low HRV. And the, not assumption, like what this is telling us is that the autonomic nervous system is in a state of anywhere from intentional recovery, unintentional recovery, or disrepair. You'll have no idea if your heart rate variability is low. You also don't know when your heart rate variability, when measured by RMSSD, if that tells you that the body is overloading the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic. They're both going to call for completely different interventions. When your heart rate variability is low and your favorite little technology says take a rest, there's going to be some people who should be wrapping up their wrists and punching the heavy bag for 2 hours. When you just only use RMSSD, you're missing a significant amount of potential information. Now, the reality is RMSSD is probably the most researched. It's probably the easiest to wrap your head around. But there might be about 7 or 8 different ways to measure heart rate variability. And we're going to glean different levels of information to make decisions. So the thing is, if your heart rate variability is low, it might be low because you're training with the intent to overreach at that particular time. So now the technology says, oh, be careful, take a rest. You may be going too hard, your heart rate variability is low. Maybe it's low because you intentionally overloaded the cardiac system and you're actually getting a very desirable response because you planned to take some time off or change your training that would be complementary to what you did previously, aka periodization. Now, if you don't know that it's happening, well then that's probably something that should be reviewed. But you still don't know what to do. Just because your number's low, if you just want to spitball and try everything, maybe one of them will work. Probably at least one will work. Or you could suggest that 1 out of every 2 will work. Because if you're loaded into the parasympathetic system, you're probably going to really do well with heavy elbows and knuckles. You might do well with dry needling that for most people is very uncomfortable. But if you're overloaded in the parasympathetic system, which is kind of how it can work, it's not one or the other, and sometimes it can even be both. Where if you're overloaded in both, you're looking at some significant time to get out of the hole if you believe in this measure and try to match it to an autonomic nervous system that leads to predictable performance and ideal motor skill acquisition. The other thing to consider with even if you looked at all forms of heart rate variability, is there are other body systems that have electrical signatures, such as the central nervous system, such as different measures that measure how energy gets into the cell. It's not an electrical event that you're measuring. It's simply algorithms, some that are proprietary, particularly omega wave where I'm the most experienced, but there's data from NASA that would use some of these other measures of DC potential that are significant when you do it for a longer period of time, not just the 3 to 5 minutes when you do it in the morning, that can give you an idea of different systems in the body are overloaded or underloaded. And most of those systems have a sweet spot where if it's doing too much, not so good, doing too little. This is not to be assumed that if the adrenal hypophyseal axis has an electrical signature that's very, very high, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with that system from a health standpoint. It just means it's overworking. And there could be some other system in the body that is motivating that compensation. Talked a lot of noise right there. RMSSD doesn't tell you any of that. So if your RMSSD is going in a very, very ideal direction, but you don't measure any other of those electrical signatures, and they're all in the dumper, it might be a 4-to-1 victory to be in a less demanding training environment. Whereas if you only had the one, because that's the one that you like to use, then you put them in a more aggressive, in a more developmental training environment, and then we wonder why they get blown up. So I think it's important to appreciate RMSSD is what we're looking at when we look at numbers in the hundreds that are very, very ideal. You look at numbers in the 20 or teens where you're in the dumper. That's a very, very useful measure. It's not the only measure. And remember, when it's low, it's not always telling you exactly what to do. Rest is not always the answer for low RMSSD. And like I said before, there's a number of other electrical signatures that can help. I remember, all with varying levels of validity, varying levels of research. A lot of these things are proprietary, where you kind of have to cluster the information with a lot of other things. Nobody should just be going red light, green light. What we're going to do is take the information and then put it through systems that maybe don't leave a significant chance for high levels of consequences. Then you start to see what's really out there and what this data is telling you. So keep that in mind when you're using HRV. And I don't know, maybe if you use HRV enough and you do so in the Crichton section of Mobile, Alabama, you might actually find that leprechaun.